Gracias al apoyo de todos nuestros patrocinadores, sin ellos no sería posible hacer IAB Conecta 2014. El enorme esfuerzo que hay detrás es extraordinario. Para nuestra siguiente conferencista, déjeme decirle que es un privilegio tenerla para nosotros como IAB. Su agenda es tremendamente demandada. Advertising Age, por ejemplo, la nombró, tal es su agenda que tiene y la influencia que tiene en el caso del mercado publicitario en Estados Unidos, que Advertising Age el año pasado la nombró como una de las mujeres más influyentes de la industria publicitaria en Estados Unidos. Ella se integró al equipo de IAB US en 2007 como Senior Vice President of Industry Services. Ha dirigido los esfuerzos de la industria completa para el establecimiento y construcción de sistemas de medición que faciliten el crecimiento de los medios interactivos. Es responsable de numerosas iniciativas de IAB que tienen trascendencia a nivel mundial y ha fomentado el awareness de oportunidades de la publicidad interactiva. Desde 2011 ha sido la líder y colabora con asociaciones como 4A's, American Association of Advertising Agencies, la Asociación Nacional de Anunciantes, o ANA, y el Media Rating Council, el MRC, con el ecosistema o el innovador proyecto 3MS, Making Measurement Make Sense. Como les mencionaba, fue galardonada con el premio Media Maven de Advertising Age y un reconocimiento muy especial para ella. Definitivamente lo que ella está construyendo en el proyecto de 3MS es esto que todos los conferencistas han venido hablando. ¿Qué sigue más allá del clic? ¿Dónde se está construyendo valor? ¿Cuáles son las métricas y cuáles son los aspectos que las marcas están tomando en cuenta para la evolución de los medios digitales? Con la conferencia Metrics Innovation, Why Brands Care About Viability and What's Next, por favor les pido un fuerte aplauso para Sherill Main.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank my dear colleagues at IAB Mexico. I am so impressed with the work that they do and with all of you and Conecta and everything about this, so I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. And I'd like also to thank in advance the translators who are about to make my New York English sound great. I was listening to the British accents and I was a little intimidated to come out and speak English after all those beautifully modulated Anglo spoke. So translators, make me sound good. I'm here to talk to you about making measurement make sense, which is basically a measurement revolution. And in order to set the stage for that, I'm going to tell you about the genesis of it and the situation in the marketplace that is probably similar to things you're experiencing. Everyone talks a lot about media fragmentation, but what we don't usually talk about is the biggest byproduct of media fragmentation, and that is metrics fragmentation. What happens when you have metrics that don't agree with each other, that are completely incompatible, but you have to plan, buy, and evaluate media and allocate money? Sorry for the use of the word dollars there. When I was writing this, I wasn't thinking, should say spend. Brand spend across platforms, and you have to assess the comparative value of media. Yet you've created metrics fragmentation, and those are the fundamental tools that you need. So making measurement make sense, or 3MS, was born of the need to facilitate the right brand allocations across media platforms. There were some other marketplace issues that were coming to play as we started thinking through how do we fix measurement, how do we make measurement make sense. And one of them is, it's very clear to everyone that digital media are being embraced by consumers in very large numbers. And if you are a marketer and you cannot get to those consumers because you don't have the tools to reach them in order to speak to them about your product, to engage them about your product and your brand, you're facing a consumer pursuit crisis. And in the United States, there's been a history of government intervention when measurement has not been good at doing its job of really assessing who's using media. So we want very much to avoid that. we also want something else to be prevented, and this is not just the sellers, this is really for the marketers. Marketers have continued to overspend in media that may or may not be yielding poor returns for their brands because they haven't had the tools to move money seamlessly across platforms. And last but not least, digital disruption. Digital disruption will continue. It's part of innovation, it's part of changing the world, making the world a digital world. And what we know is we have to expect the unexpected. So what do we do in order to plan for measurement change? How do we manage that? That's what measurement governance is really about. So it's not about regulation, it's not about the government per se, it's about overseeing on a self-regulatory way within the free market constraints, and in the US there are many, as you know, overseeing how you plan for measurement change so that digital disruption does not cause you to be unable to use digital media. What's our vision? Ultimately, after we get through a lot of the steps that we're currently engaged in the US, the vision is all media are evaluated, planned, and bought on common metrics so that brand advertisers will know if they got what they paid for and if their advertising worked. And 3MS, I mentioned it, the measurement revolution. Well, what is it? It's a cross-ecosystem initiative that was founded by, these are probably unfamiliar other than the IAB, the 4As, the ANA, the IAB. So here's a bit of a footnote. In the United States, media trade organizations tend to be segmented by which portion of the market they represent. So the 4As is the American Association of Advertisers. The ANA is the organization that represents the interests of the marketers and advertisers, the Association of National Advertisers. And in addition, because of this issue of measurement change management, governance, and also if you are going about writing standards, creating metrics, overseeing the quality of measurement, you need an independent body. You need gravitas, you need media agnostic group to be involved. Also bring about changes in prices and segmenting on prices. But we also believe digital media are valuable for advertisers, and in order for them to be accountable to their shareholders, even to their consumers, they really need to have the correct tools. And the agencies are also under pressure to be accountable to their clients and to the industry in general. The other part of the mission, clear standards-based metrics for interactive advertising that are comparable to legacy media. Legacy media, what do we mean by that? TV, mostly, as you'll see, a lot of the work that we're doing in 3MS is to be comparable to television. It's still the core driver of most media plans in advertising for brand advertisers. But it's TV, it's radio, it's print, it's all media ultimately. So legacy media, we didn't like the word traditional because traditional implies old and stodgy, and we know all media are going digital. That's the use of that term. And we're also supporting the MRC as they set measurement standards and manage measurement change. They're a very small organization. They need the entire marketing and media ecosystem to get behind them in the US as well. Again, who's involved? I think the really key point is the one at the bottom. More than 300 executives and industry experts to date have participated in 3MS efforts and in writing some of the standards that I'm going to tell you about, which leads me directly into the companies. You are going to see now lots of logos flying by you. I wanted everyone to get a full flavor for how deep and wide the executives and the experts who represented their companies and sat in the teams that came up with the 3MS solutions. The concept was, if you work in a trade association or you're the MRC or any of the interested parties, you can look in and know what is needed, but the decisions and the thinking and the development of the program to remedy some of the measurement issues has to come from business leaders, has to come from experts. So here we have the current configuration of who sits on our blue ribbon task force, the companies. And here are some of the other ones who have continually participated in various 3MS teams. So you see the marketers, the publishers, the agencies, and you see the supporting associations, and you'll notice one additional one that wasn't on my earlier slide, the Advertising Research Foundation. They are now working with all of us to help build out some of the standards and do some of the science behind the standard writing. These are the 5 principles of measurement. These were reached through lots of hard work by those industry leaders and by those experts. And if you'll notice, you see there's a double-edged arrow that goes down the side. Facilitate cross-platform comparisons. Media are not planned or bought in isolation. They have to work together, and you have to understand how to evaluate them for brands. So the first thing was everyone sat down and said, gee, we really need a good definition of an impression that is comparable to legacy media. We need to establish audience currency. The third one, there are a plethora. We are blessed in digital media that our ads have so many capabilities, and there's so much you can do to be creative and to engage and to bring about interaction, much more than the kinds of units that you have in static media. But everybody calls these things different things. Nobody really knows, are there certain features or capabilities that work better than others? So we need a taxonomy of ad units. The fourth one speaks to something really, really important. And all of the people who have worked on 3MS and all of those companies all felt this way as well. It's not enough to have equivalized metrics that allow you to go across platforms. You also need to agree as an ecosystem, what are the specific things that are unique to interactivity that help build brands, and how do you quantify them? So that's what that refers to, brand ad performance metrics. And the last one is the brand attitudinal measurement. And that's kind of the upper funnel classic measures. And in digital, there have been many efforts to measure those upper funnel variables and to assess how well brand building succeeds in the digital world, but still there's a need for standardization and then to take it across platforms. So how did they define how it should be operationalized? So the first one, the by now notorious shift from a serve to a viewable impression. The second one, introduce an online GRP. It has to have viewable impressions built in. The third one I told you about, classification system. The fourth one, this one has evolved, and I'm going to show you where it's evolved to, but it started out with, we know that view-throughs are not standard, and we know that they represent something that is unique to interactivity. We know that there are many metrics for social activity. There has to be a way to do a cumulative social activity metric that will help people understand how it contributed to brand building. Again, it's evolved. I'll get there. The last one, the sort of messiness of online brand impact studies, establish standards, get the vendors to be validated so that those methodologies are better. And of course, the intent is that ultimately you go cross-platform and have some consistency. So where are we? This is the language that appears in the new display ad viewability measurement standard. You'll notice that there is a big italic around measurement. Why? As we have been ramping up and implementing in the US market, it's occurred to us that there's a bit of confusion in the marketplace about what does a measurement standard do, what does a transactional standard do. A measurement standard sets a minimum that is required for counting. A transactional standard is determined by markets. Markets ebb and flow, and so they take a measurement standard as a baseline, and then they use that to start transacting. So this is the measurement standard. It's very meticulous language. I took it straight out of the guideline. requires that that measurer, meaning the measurement vendor, determines pixel requirement first. So that's a minimum of 50% of pixels on an in-focus browser on the viewable space of the browser page. Then comes the time requirement. The time the pixel requirement is met must be greater than or equal to 1 continuous second post-ad render. Now, this standard, or some approximation of it, 50% of pixels for a minimum of 1 second, was kind of in play from the get-go, but the work that went into this, there were billions and billions of impressions that were analyzed in order to make sure that this standard is empirically the right one. So there was science behind it. The MRC did those. There were tests done. I want to call out one exception to the 50% for 1 second, and that's the IAB Rising Stars. So those are the units that are equivalent to 970 by 250. Because of their size, the minimum for them is set at 30% of pixels. Video. As of June 30th, we are also in a world of video ad viewability. Again, measurement called out in italics because it's a minimum. So you see, it's very similar, 50% of ad pixels, but here's where it's different. The time the pixel requirement is met is 2 continuous seconds. It doesn't necessarily have to be the first 2 seconds of the video ad. What qualifies is any unduplicated ad content comprising 2 continuous seconds. I would like to tell you that this was easy to get to. However, that would be a lie. It took months and months of meetings. It took, again, millions of impressions of data and lots of debates. There were people who wanted to go to the millisecond for the requirement. Then there were people who said, no, we should have a full completion rate. And this agency wanted that, and that publisher wanted that, and that ad network wanted something else. We arrived at this, again, because there was a lot of science underlying it. Many companies donated, billions of impressions donated to the MRC, and the science behind it was that in more than 80% of cases, if someone was there for 2 continuous seconds, they were there for the full video. So that's how that became the minimum. And people question it, and people write about it. I'm sure you've read stuff in the press. Audio is recognized as being important because in TV, you can hear an impression, and you can measure that. However, some of the technology that we would need to be able to track the sound in all situations is not there yet for audio, so it's not part of the requirement for the video viewable impression. What's the status? What's happening? Some of you may have heard that the march to the viewable impression for display was delayed at one point, and so the MRC had issued an advisory against trading on viewable impressions. That ended March 31st. Why did it end on March 31st? It ended then because the MRC completed what was called the reconciliation study. There are 12 measurement vendors who have been audited and accredited for the measurement of viewable impressions in the US. Many people say, well, what were they audited against? What were they accredited against if you were still writing a standard? And if the same body, the MRC, was overseeing that? So the way that it works, and it has worked traditionally in the US when there's measurement change, you need a sufficient amount of looking under the hood and literally seeing how is the processing done, how is the data reported, in order to understand what the measurement vendors are doing, how they're meeting the standard. And what happened was, yes, they were meeting the standard as it was written, but, and this has continued to be an issue for us, and I'll speak more about it afterwards as well, there were variances on a campaign level that were quite wide, even when you used MRC audited and accredited vendors, and there's 12 of them out there. So MRC examined how and why accredited viewability measurement vendors could produce disparate numbers. They came up with a list of 6 processing and methodological refinements that had to be made by the vendors who have been accredited in order to get to, and this is the hope and the goal, get to plus or minus 10% tolerated range of differences. Now, for video viewability, because we had this great debate that went on and on about the duration minimum, the gating period, I know these are like the advisory gating period. The gating period basically said, even though the marketplace knew that the standards were being developed, and even though we knew what the display standard would be, because for video we settled on 2 seconds later than we did for the display requirements, we'll keep everybody looking at the data and testing until June 30th. Now, do be aware that in video viewability in the US, there are 3 accredited vendors for measuring video viewability, so we're not seeing the kinds of variances that we saw across the 12 for display. And now, before I click and go to the video, I want to tell you about the educational efforts that have to be undertaken continually. We are constantly testing, educating. And when I say we, I'm referring to the IAB, the advertisers, the ANA, the 4As, the entire ecosystem. What does viewability mean? And as part of the educational process and the press process and having one message, we hired a PR agency, and you are about to see one of the things they produced for us.
If your message isn't being seen, you're wasting your time and money. Learn how the new viewability standards benefit you.
So, what have we learned as we've ramped up for viewability and for implementation and going through this educational process? And this is really important, and should all of you join this measurement revolution and go to viewable impressions, and I know many of you are already working on that, you will see that because of cross-domain iframes, there are a chunk of impressions per campaign that are non-measurable. What does it mean? And I've had to say this over and over again in the US, a non-measurable impression does not equal a non-viewable impression. It just means that it couldn't be measured properly, likely because of cross-domain iframes. There are some companies out there who are vendors, measurement vendors, who have overcome some of the challenges posed by cross-domain iframes, and they've also been audited and accredited. So we are seeing the number of non-measurable impressions being reduced. Concurrent with all of this effort swirling around viewability and the measurement of it, and this is all for display, and the debate for digital video, we were also suddenly in a situation where the press was conflating viewability with fraud. Fraudulent impressions surfaced as a big issue in the press, and many reporters wrote about viewability and fraud as though they were one and the same thing. And I'm here to tell you, as I've told them, and as I've said many times in the US, they are not. A non-viewable impression does not equal a fraudulent impression. Is there a greater likelihood that a viewable impression is a legitimate impression? Yes, but it doesn't mean that a viewable impression is not fraudulent. So we are now also engaged in educating about viewability and fraud, and should you be reading anything about that, this is our position and this is the best of our knowledge. Where viewability and fraud do overlap is, in order to get measurement to be accurate, there must be rigorous filtration of non-human traffic. So that's kind of where they meet, but they're very separate issues. So, currency change is hard. Technology solutions are complex. we continue to face challenges in implementing viewable impressions. And we have 3 big challenges. We're dealing with them now. One is publisher implementation costs. Publishers have to buy more than one data source. They have to test. Some of the data, as we said, is still disparate. We're still not in that desired range of tolerance. Publishers are also redesigning their sites. They're trying to optimize viewability of the ad placements. So for now, publishers are really bearing a large cost to do business. We also have the disparity that I mentioned to you, and what happens is there's some anxiety in the market that there are varying viewability levels for some campaigns, and some agencies want to use one vendor versus another. So in the US, there's a bit of a question mark about how do we get to a place where every publisher doesn't have to buy, for example, all 12 vendors and all 3 for video viewability. What we're hearing from the large holding companies is that they are working with 3 or 4 of the measurement vendors. They typically don't say publicly exactly which ones, but they're also telling us and telling the publishing community in a lot of the educational sessions that we run in the US, they're telling us that they're willing to share data. They're willing to tell publishers exactly which vendors they're looking at. However, there still is this issue of multiple vendors and varying viewability. We believe that at a holding company level, as they're telling us, the tolerances are being reduced to the plus or minus 10%. But we do know that at a campaign level, some of the publishers are saying they're not in that range yet. The other challenge that we have in the market in the US, many folks are saying, well, we're not really transacting on this yet. And others are saying, oh, yes, we are. Why are we hearing 2 different stories? Basically because viewability has yet to be integrated into billing systems. So the evaluation on the part of most of the agencies for who should be on a buy and for generating RFPs is being done on some viewability metric along with other requirements that they have. However, because it's not yet in billing systems, you can't guarantee and you can't bill on it. So if all these challenges are still there, and if we've been working on this, and why do we keep on keeping on? Very simply, without the comparable metrics, advertisers will continue to disproportionately value and spend on media that they can count on and that they can count, and that's typically television. If we start to count the same way, we will go past a lot of our supply chain and workflow issues, and we'll start talking about the value of digital media to brands. The other thing is that there's an undercurrent among some in the US market that GRPs, they're an old metric, why are we bringing them back, who cares? Well, all of the models for allocating spend across media for big brands are using GRPs, and guess what? In a fragmented world, scale changes all the time. What was once small reach is now big reach. So the thing about scale is it's important to sell value, and we can't get there if we can't count the same way. And that's what applies to segmenting inventory and price elasticity. You're going to have a robust market. You're going to know which inventory works, how to measure it, how to combine it with other media, but we have to get there. So we need some more innovation in order to get to the real future that 3MS envisions, and that was the vision that I put up earlier, where all media are planned, bought, allocated, and evaluated through common metrics. And why am I saying we are still, despite everything and despite this notion of we have to keep on keeping on, we are on the threshold of the revolution. We know transactions are occurring without the billable portion, so the guarantees aren't there. The buy side in the US is pressing for viewability adoption. Everyone understands that a fundamental of advertising is the opportunity to see. We need to get this done because we need to move the dialogue away from this conflation with fraudulent impressions, and all of it is being done for accountability. Advertisers need to be accountable, agencies do, so do publishers. There's another thing bubbling up in the US market. there's a request, there's sort of a desire now, let's get going on standards for GRPs in digital and cross-platform, which is the second principle of 3MS. So we can't really finish that work, even if we start it, unless we're done with viewability. But we can start. GRPs are in market in the US. Both Nielsen and ComScore provide digital GRPs, but there isn't yet a standard. And we need to have consistent and transparent standards, and they need to also ultimately go into the world of television. And then there's mobile. We still haven't worked through the issues of mobile measurement so that we can use mobile the way you've been hearing. Everybody wants mobile to be an integral part of big brand campaigns. So we need to get there for mobile as well. And as I told you earlier, there were 5 guiding principles and 5 solutions, and 3MS is more than viewability. I'd like to show you the progress. I mentioned earlier that we have evolved beyond the original thinking of the brand ad performance metrics and how we should go about standardizing. So as I mentioned, the goal of guiding principle number 4 is to identify metrics that are unique to interactivity that build brands. Once we've identified them, then standardize them. As we tried to think through how should that work, should we tackle standardizing social media metrics? Should we tackle view-throughs? We realized that the heart and soul of brand ad performance metrics and interactivity actually lies in the land of engagement. I've never been a fan of using that word because it means so many different things to so many different people. Literally hundreds, if not thousands, of metrics are out there. So we said, let's tackle it. Let's finally tackle it. Let's get agencies together, publishers, have it be reviewed by marketers who are members of the ANA, and let's really figure out what's engagement. And we came up with a definition: a spectrum of consumer advertising activities and experiences, cognitive, emotional, and physical, that will have a positive impact on a brand. So you're probably sitting there saying, okay, lots of words, some of them big. What does it really mean? I need to just look at one note that I made, because at the end of this discussion of engagement, I want to tell you where the reference is. So if you're interested in looking at the white paper that defines engagement, I can get you there. Basically, we looked at hundreds and thousands. I think we went over 1,000 metrics, and we said there are 30 core metrics of all of these engagement conversations. The physical ones are behavioral, and they are the ones that are the interactive ones. They are the ones that come from the world of analytics. The cognitive ones are kind of the upper funnel. So in the end, of the 30 that we came up with, we have 7 cognitive, 4 emotional, and 19 behavioral metrics. And this is how the continuum is depicted graphically. We realized early on, when you're dealing with established brands, there is a level of pre-engagement. It's cognitive, but it's also emotional, because you have a brand perception, a brand favorability. So we need to relate that, because as engagement builds, you're then getting into the more behavioral and emotional. And then when you start looking at analytics and you look at physical activity, interaction, gaze rates, swiping, and then you say, well, wait a minute, in social media, there's like, that shows something, but it doesn't show all that much. A lot of people are on there just liking. So where does the emotion come in some of these more interactive focused metrics? And social media was a great case, because when you share, when you recommend, you are putting yourself out there, especially when you start to recommend a brand. So that's an emotional investment, and you measure that through some of these behavioral metrics. So everything starts to interrelate, and we also have things like swipes and taps. So we finally, in the 3MS process, have opened the door to putting some mobile specific metrics, because we need them and we need to build on. So I urge you, if you're interested in engagement, to take a look at the white paper. It's got some really interesting things in it, and it will help you start thinking systematically about how brands are built, how all media work together, and what is this big nebulous thing called engagement where everyone tells you every other day that there's a different metric. There shouldn't be a different metric. 30 is quite enough. And before I close and give back a few minutes in case the next speaker needs it, I'd like to issue what I call the global call to action. Join the revolution. Make digital media the first truly global media. What do I mean by that? We have an opportunity here where we know this medium is being used worldwide. We know everybody is digital today. We know businesses are changing, they're going digital. For the first time, we can build metrics that can be used across different countries. And they can really make this seamless and global and make it easy for global advertisers to know how to buy, how to plan, how to evaluate. And I also urge you, and again, I thank my colleagues with IAB Mexico, follow the developments. Keep on learning in your own markets and keep on looking at what does this mean. Test whatever data is out there. Question the vendors. Question processes. Don't buy every piece of information you hear. Start to be discriminating about it. And this is a great reference for you. measurementnow.net. This is the website that was set up by 3MS, the ANA, the 4As, and the IAB. It is full of valuable information, including copies of the standards, including the video I showed you, another PSA about viewability, the press. There's a whole section on the conversation in the trade press and the general press in the US. So it's a great resource if you're interested in all things measurement related, particularly the 3MS ones. And with that, I thank you again.
Sherill, thank you very much.
You are welcome.
Thank you for saving some time in your busy agenda for coming to Mexico. It's a real pleasure for us. And I have seen how 3MS has been an enormous effort. What would be your advice for Mexico learning from that? Because it has been an effort of at least 3 years.
Yes. So my advice for Mexico would be get started and get started now, because you are a younger market. You have fewer vested interests in how digital should be measured. I recognize that TV is well established. You have issues there with things being measured cross-platform, and I know your marketplace has constraints around measurement and who's involved and how they're involved that may be different than the US, but you don't have as much of a history of digital should be this way or it should be that way. It took us a whole year to have some of the digital natives who oppose viewability understand that it has to happen. Their thinking was the algorithms take care of it. But that's okay for performance advertising. That's great for cost per click or cost per action. It doesn't work for brands. And what's interesting now is even in the programmatic space, there are programmatic platforms that are touting their ability to use viewable impressions through programmatic pipelines. So things have changed. But it was an uphill battle, so start early.
Thank you very much, Sherill. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank
Un fuerte aplauso, por favor, para Sherill Main.
you.
Gracias por acompañarnos. Y, por favor.